Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. It is early morning here in the UK. I've got my nice cup of coffee with my boat mug. and today's video is actually going to be a lovely excerpt from my Secret Language podcast, which is one of the many things I create over on my Patreon page, linked in the description. Now, in this episode, I answered a bunch of questions, and one of them was a really great topic about the importance of developing a great accent in your target language, but also, is it possible to even maybe develop a perfect or native-like accent? And then finally, in my response, I also took the approach of asking the question, should we even try? Now, I have to say, the feedback on the first 3 episodes of my podcast has just been absolutely phenomenal. It really seems like people just love the super cozy, warm, high quality vibe that I create in both audio and video format. The longer format of 1 hour, the storytelling, it's just been a really lovely experience. And I'm super excited to tell you that new episodes are going to be coming out every single week now for the next few months at least. And I will also be sharing more of these excerpts on the channel just for everybody else to enjoy. So cheers, happy language learning, have a great day, and I hope you enjoy this video. Welcome back to the Secret Language podcast, exclusively available here on Patreon. I'm your host, Robin MacPherson, and this is a show where I answer your questions about all kinds of topics ranging from language learning tips, methods, and advice to personal stories from my own experience learning and speaking languages out in the world. So grab yourself a drink, maybe a snack, and let's jump into today's episode. So this question is going to be on the importance of having a good or an even perfect accent. Let's go ahead and read the question. So Margarita says, how important is it for you to have a perfect accent in your target language? I still struggle to remove the Italian influence when I speak English, and to be honest, it's quite discouraging. I noticed that this aspect has a strong negative effect on my self-confidence. For instance, even if I have been studying English for 15 years, I'm still shy and uncomfortable when it comes to speaking it. On the other hand, I enjoy so much speaking Brazilian Portuguese because I have a better accent, even if it's not perfect. So this is a great question, and there's a lot of ways to tackle this, but I think this is relevant and it relates to the first question in some ways, right? We're talking about this idea of perfection versus, being close to perfection, and what does that mean? Is it possible, but also does it matter? And in this case, I think there's also just a great amount of, so much of this is really just in our heads, right? And this is where I think, as in so many cases, language learning is such a wonderful vehicle for improving our lives on the whole, right? Language learning presents us with so many opportunities to sort of practice things that are so wide-reaching in our lives. So in this case, the example is self-confidence. So much of, the issues that a lot of us face with self-confidence, my gosh, I struggle daily. I mean, if anything, this might be the biggest obstacle in my life, especially as it pertains to going outside, meeting people, developing a social life, meeting a romantic partner, and all that stuff. This has been a massive obstacle for years for me, this issue of self-confidence. So it is so often, if not almost always, in our heads, right? It all really comes down to the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we think and feel about ourselves. It's about how do we compare ourselves to others, right? How much importance do we put on that comparison? And so I think it's a great example of how, dealing with this kind of thing in your language learning can be super helpful in dealing with, let's say you are someone who also has self-confidence issues outside of that in your life, right? So that's kind of just a meta point. But yeah, so that's my first, I guess, note on this, is that so much of this is all just about you comparing yourself to whether it's native speakers, right? If we're talking about perfection, a perfect accent, as you said, or other learners. And, how important is that? In my opinion, we had a wonderful question from Cassandra in a previous episode about how to make a native speaker more comfortable talking to you. And in that response that I gave, I talked a lot about how, for me, it's often not actually the accent. It's often not your pronunciation that is the biggest barrier to people understanding you. A lot of times, it's actually your intonation, your rhythm, the clarity with which you speak, right? The speed at which you speak relative to those other things, right? You might speak really fast, but in a really sort of strange rhythm and a strange intonation, and with the word stress in the wrong places. And so speaking very quickly combined with those other things suddenly makes it very hard to understand you, where if you spoke more slowly, that might be a lot easier. So those other things, I think, are often far more important than having an extremely good accent. And as I said in that response, the good news is that I think those things are in some ways easier to train, easier to practice, because when we talk about accent and pronunciation, there are some legitimate physical barriers, right? The example of some people just cannot roll their R's. There are some really difficult sounds, like the Russian like the French, like merci. Even the Mandarin Chinese R, there's a bunch of sounds that there's some level of physical barrier to overcome. And for some of us, that comes easier than others. So that's good news, So I think that when it comes to how important is it to have a great accent or a good accent, I think the most important barrier to cross is just having a baseline comprehensible accent, right? I think, yes, there's obviously a point where if your accent is so strong, if it starts to inhibit pronunciation, then that's perhaps where, yes, improving it can really benefit you a great deal. But I think that, in my opinion, that's actually quite a low bar. Like, I don't think your accent has to be that good, right? I have known many people from so many countries, whether it's Italy, France, it could be from China, it could be from Japan, it could be, so many examples. I've met so many people with really strong accents, but that I could understand just fine, and that they communicated very effectively. And I think it's because of those other factors that I mentioned. So I honestly think that in terms of, this self-confidence issue, a lot of times we're probably already good enough, more than good enough, to be great communicators in the language. And so it really just comes down to what our goals are and how much we value that comparison to others that might have a better accent or a more accurate accent. But I don't think that it's as important as we often make it out to be. And it's interesting because in my case, I love to have a good accent. I love to try to develop a good accent. I don't necessarily make it my absolute utmost focus. I'm far more focused most of the time on trying to speak accurately in terms of my grammar, my sentence structure, choosing the correct words, choosing words that are either colloquial or specifically appropriate, right? Because if I'm in a formal setting, then colloquial might not be the most appropriate thing I'm going for. But those things are much more my focus. But usually, and again, it always feels weird saying anything positive about myself, I think I usually develop a pretty good accent in the languages that I speak. It's certainly feedback I get from people. And I think that it comes as a byproduct of the way that I practice, right? I'm constantly repeating, right? Every time I repeat, I remember, like, I think I told this story once before, when I was learning the French R, I used to trip over my tongue and merci. And every time I repeated it, and I specifically remember this, it felt like every repetition was like a teeny tiny bit closer. And I just did it 1,000 times, 10,000 times. I mean, just constantly, especially the word merci, merci, c'est gentil, merci. Like, I just over and over and over again. So before I could even really accurately string sentences together, I had already practiced so much, the mechanics of making those sounds. And I think it's also just part of being detail oriented, right? And being very meticulous about things. So yeah, I don't, in terms of being perfect, I think it's pretty similar to the question about native level. I think you can get pretty close, right? And maybe some people would argue that they know people who really do have a perfect accent. I've met people who really are darn good. I mean, and some people who are known online for having like a native accent. But the truth is, when I listen to them, if I'm really being honest, it's not quite there. If I really truly critique it, and maybe it doesn't sound foreign, but it doesn't quite fit any particular accent that I'm used to. But that's also a funny topic for me to talk about, because my accent in English baffles everybody at this point because of the life that I have led. So even then, again, I think, maybe you can, right? I'm not going to argue with anybody that says, no, you definitely can reach a perfect accent. I don't think it's that important. And one thing I will say, and this is sort of a different aspect of the question and of the response, I think having an accent is a really beautiful thing. Like, I've always accepted the fact that if I think about people in my life who are second language speakers of English or third or fourth language speakers of English, I love their accents. I can't think of anybody where I'm like, oh God, Most of the time it's endearing. It might be cute. It might be delightful, lovely. Like, a lot of times it's endearing, right? And so when I think about the people in my life who have even strong accents, but I love it. I love listening to them talk. I could listen for hours because, the accent is so pleasant and nice, and it gives them so much character. It makes them who they are. It is quite literally a part of who they are, right? Because that accent is a product of either where they come from, the experiences and the life that they have lived. Like, if we think about my accent, it is very much a product of the life and the story that I have lived. And so why would I want to eliminate that just so I could fit in with everybody else? So in some ways, it's nice. I like having a little bit of an accent. It's a part of my story. And if anything, your accent, it's almost like the most clear and upfront way for you to tell that story, right? So I made a video in Japanese recently. I was blown away by this. I don't know, how accurate it is, but I made a video. It was a short documentary piece telling the missing, untold story of why I didn't really speak Japanese for almost 7 years, why I didn't talk about it, make any content about it, really. And in that video, I told the story of how Fukuoka was just such a special part of my life, how the people I met there were, to this day, perhaps some of the best friends I've ever had in my entire life. I felt more loved and accepted in Fukuoka with those people than I've ever felt in my life, right? Which is amazing to think. In the comments, somebody said, this is a native Japanese speaker, said, It's so amazing and so special because even though you may have lost contact with those friends, which is tragic, they are living on in your Japanese. And that person said, and I couldn't believe this. They said you do have a bit of an accent. You've retained. There's some things you say where you have a sort of southern Japanese accent, where you talk a little bit like somebody would from down there, and other times maybe a little bit Kansai. So even after 7 years of not speaking Japanese, because let me tell you, it was much stronger before. I used to very deliberately speak in different Japanese dialects. So I learned quite a bit of Hakata Ben at one point, and then later I learned a pretty solid amount of Kansai Ben. And we're not just talking the words, but we're talking intonation, rhythm, like really specific stuff. And I used to love playing with Japanese dialects. So, but the point is, isn't that beautiful? I think that is just the most wonderful thing, right? If I could choose between keeping that, right? Keeping that part of my story to be always told every time that I speak in Japanese, right? To have a little bit of that southern sort of Hakata, Fukuoka sort of accent mixed in with a bit of Kansai sort of sound. I would keep that any day, even if it sounds foreign to a degree, over clicking my fingers and having a perfect, standard Tokyo accent. So that's my thought on this. So Margarita, I have seen you speak in English. I think you speak beautifully. I love your accent. I think it fits you. Like the way that you speak in English, I personally find it endearing, and I don't think that you should. I mean, you can certainly strive to improve it, and I would never tell you to not seek improvement if that's what you want. But I don't think you should feel self-doubt. I don't think you should feel embarrassed or unconfident. I think you speak English beautifully, and I think that any other native or foreign English speaker would agree. I'm sure there are many people who would be envious of your accent in English. So that's my thought. I would love to hear what you think about that, Margarita, but I'd also love to hear everybody's thoughts.